Today we're going to be tying a somewhat different fly, and that is an ant, which is an example of a terrestrial. Now, terrestrials is a term that's used to refer to any insect that lives basically all of its lifetime on land. And so therefore, ants and crickets and grasshoppers and moths and other species of insects like that are referred to as terrestrials, as compared to a insect which lives predominantly all of its life in the water, which we've tied on many occasions, which is considered an aquatic insect. So to return again to our theme for today, we're going to be tying an ant. Now, why did I choose an ant? Well, one reason is because they're very plentiful at this time of the year, and they seem to be packed with energy, and some believe that it's the formic acid that's in ants that attracts the fish's attention. But nonetheless, a nice gathering of ants on a summer day is a good source of food for fish, not only trout, but for all many other types of freshwater fishes. And so we're going to be tying two forms of the ant today. The one is a floating ant, which obviously is going to represent the mature ant when it's floating on the water. And the other is going to be also an imitation of a mature ant. However, this is one that you might say has drowned, or it's floating in the surface film. It's fallen off a tree or blown by the wind into a stream or onto a lake or something like that. Perhaps it's fallen off of some sort of vegetation and ends up in the lake. So you might say that fish are going to be looking up when it comes to looking for terrestrial insects. And so the ant, on a warm summer day, perhaps with a little breeze and fishing someplace where there's vegetation, is going to be an excellent type of offering to give to the fish. So I hope that you enjoyed today's tying, and we'll be starting very shortly. The first ant that we're going to be tying is going to be the version that I referred to in the very beginning of my introduction, and that would be what I would refer to as a wet ant. In other words, one that's floating in the surface film. There's only a few materials that's used to create this. Of course, black thread, because I'm going to do a black ant. And the hook that is in the vise in front of you is a 94840 Mustad size 14 hook. And we probably want to try to represent the size of the insect with the hook size. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be starting my thread just behind the eye and wrapping it back a short distance, and then stopping just short of the midpoint, or maybe 1/3 of the way back. And then I take a small amount of my dubbing, and again I'm using a black superfine dubbing. Most of these dubbings are made from beaver, and so though beaver hair is fine, it doesn't have any guard hairs, it's excellent for making the bodies on dry flies, and in particular, in this case, making it for an ant. So I have started my thread, and I've proceeded back about 1/3. Now I'm going to dub that just by taking small amounts of this black dubbing, applying it to the thread, twisting it on in a counterclockwise direction, which will keep it from unraveling. And so I hope that you can see I have a very thin noodle. And the first thing I will do is start to wrap this forward from this 2/3 point, or 1/3 of the way behind the eye, and wrap it up to the eye, and then begin to go back over it again, so that we're building up sort of a football shape part of the body, which in this case would be the thorax. So most insects have three body parts: the head, followed by the thorax, followed by the abdomen. So There are some exceptions to that, but the ant is a traditional type of insect that has these three body parts. So what I'm creating right now is basically the thorax. And in this pattern, we're not representing the head of the ant, but in the following pattern that I will be showing you, we will be putting a head on that ant as well as the abdomen and the thorax. So I'm creating this football-shaped, although it's rather blunt, type of thorax on this ant. And I'll explain to you why I did this first as we proceed. So just about have that the way I want it. And bringing my thread back. And now I'm covering a little portion of the abdomen with my thread. And then what I will do is add more dubbing and proceed to build up the abdomen. So ants and most other types of terrestrials have predominantly a body that's created using dubbing of one sort or another. So you might think that you could apply the same principles that I'm using in this pattern to make a beetle or to make maybe a moth pattern or some other type of terrestrial. So I'm working right now to create that long abdomen, which is also going to be an elongated sort of football shaped on this fly. So again, you see me applying more and more dubbing until I get just about the amount that I want. And notice where I'm starting this abdomen. It's just beyond the start of the bend of the hook. So I will point to it with my scissors. The bend of the hook starts about here, and I am just wrapping this dubbing slightly behind that. So bring that forward again. So I'm getting close to the point where I'm going to be content that I have the right amount of dubbing on here to simulate not only the thorax, which I created earlier, but now the abdomen. And that's just about it right there. Okay, so I'm bringing my thread back to mid-shank, and at this point, I'm going to be tying in the so-called wing, which is basically just a feather that represents not a wing, but more so the legs on this ant, because ants, like any other insect, has 6 legs, and so the hackle fibers that we're going to be putting on here is going to represent those legs extending out to the side of the ant. So you notice what I have done is I've clipped off some of the bottom, the butt section of this piece of hackle, and I pre-sized this for the size 14 hook so that as the individual fibers are protruding out from the stem, excuse me, of the hackle or of the feather, they will basically be about the same as the gap of the hook. So I want to take a little bit more of that off. Now I'm trimming off a small amount of the hackle fibers on each side. I lay this right across that opening where we just put thread, but between the abdomen and the thorax. And I lay that on there and I tie it in with 2 wraps this way and then 2 wraps behind the hackle. So it basically creates sort of an X-shaped tying in point. And now I can clip off the remaining little piece of hackle that's sticking forward and then wrap this in with my tying thread. Okay, now I'm going to do what I've referred to in some other videos, is I'm going to break the back of the hackle before I wrap it. And the reason I want to do that is so this hackle, instead of laying to the rear of the fly, is basically going to be going perpendicular. So I'm making one whip finish just to secure what I tied in there, and put my thread rest off to the side. And then the next thing I will do is get a hold of this hackle with my hackle pliers. And as I just mentioned a moment ago, you'll notice that what I do is pull my feather forward a little bit to sort of break that stem just slightly. And then I begin to make wraps. And I'm starting right against the abdomen and making wraps around that part of the hook where I did not have any dubbing. And with each turn, I'm moving it more and more forward. Until I fill that gap with hackle fibers. Maybe one more. Approximately 4, 5, maybe 6 wraps. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is trap this feather so that it is on the underside. Bringing one wrap over the thread. Oh, I'm sorry, one wrap of thread over the hackle where it's lying, and wrapping behind, and then bringing it, exchanging hands, and bringing it over the top in front of that feather. Now I can clip that off, and that would be clipping off the hackle, and then holding it back, making several thread wraps right immediately in front of those hackle fibers, and then whip finishing at that point. Now we're just about finished. I can clip my thread off at this point after I've done whip finish. And I hope you see that the reason that I tied in the thorax first, or the thorax head portion first, is so that I did not end up putting that on later and having to tie off the fly right at the eye. This is a little trick that I saw on a video recently, and I think it gives a much more good representation of the silhouette of an ant. And I'll try to hold up a piece of white material behind this so that you'll get a better idea of what this fly looks like. Now we're just about finished. The only thing that's left to do is I want to trim off a little bit of the fibers on the top of this ant. Because remember, this does not have a wing. These hackle fibers are representing the legs. So I trim a little bit off there and a little bit off the bottom, right down the center. So now this ant pattern, or this ant imitation, is going to be riding right in the surface film with the fibers sticking out sort of like an outrigger holding the fly right in the surface film as it proceeds along. So again, very simple way of tying a simple ant. This one would just be referred to as a black dubbed ant. So I hope that you've learned something from this. And in the next segment, we'll be tying then another ant pattern, one which has wings and which would be riding upright on the water as if it were a live ant. So I hope that you've enjoyed this one. The next ant pattern which we'll be tying will be that of a floating ant. So I'm going to be starting my thread just behind the eye of the hook and proceeding all the way to the rear of the hook with just a light group of thread wraps, clipping off the excess thread, and then wrapping the thread back to the mid shank, but just slightly in front of that. And I just want to set my hook up a little bit higher there, moving the thread again to just beyond the midpoint. Now I've already taken and prepared a piece of foam. This is 2 millimeter thick foam, and this is probably about maybe 4 millimeters wide. And this is going to represent the abdomen, and another piece similar in size will represent the thorax and the head of the fly. So I'm taking this and laying it just on top of the thread, on top of the hook, and making thread wraps while holding this firmly on top of the hook, making these thread wraps all the way back to the bend of the hook. And this basically will represent then the underside of the abdomen of this fly. But in order to make it glisten a little bit more, and what I would like to do at this point, and I'll explain why, is just put a small amount of glue on this to sort of secure it on the underside on the hook. So while that's drying, then I will get my dubbing prepared, because I'm at this point on this fly where now we've created a sort of an underbody, but now I'm going to put a little bit of dubbing on, and this particular dubbing is more coarse than what we use for the dry fly, and it also has some antron fibers in it, which is going to give it the underside of this fly somewhat of a glistening effect. So I'm going to wrap or apply some of this dubbing, again putting it on in a counterclockwise direction, sliding it up the hook, making several thread wraps of dub thread around the abdomen of this fly, just building up somewhat of a sparkled underbody. Now this is a little tricky to use, because unlike the dry fly dubbing that we used in the first fly, this tends to want to move somewhat because it's not as fine. It has a lot of guard hairs as well as that antron. So I'm just putting down a light layer of this. I would refer to it as sparkle dubbing, but that's not what it's called. In this particular case, this is referred to as Ligas stillwater fly dubbing. And just a little bit more there. Okay, that's probably enough. Now, the next thing I will do is fold this forward, pushing it down and making several thread wraps. The first one's going to be loose. The second one's going to be much tighter, pulling down. It creates a nice abdomen on this fly. Okay. Now I'm going to clip that off, this foam, and use the rest of it in a subsequent step. Before I do that, before I proceed, I'm trimming off as much of this excess abdomen that I have, and now I'll make a series of thread wraps to crush down that small amount that's still laying forward. Okay. And right at that point, then I want to tie in some antron, which will represent a somewhat of a wing. And this actually, I said antron, but this is actually polyarn. It's very similar material, but it does not have antron fibers in it. So it does not have that sparkle, but nonetheless, it's going to imitate the wing quite comfortably, and the fly fisher should be able to see this wing sticking up as the fly floats along in the surface film. So I'm just going to secure that with a couple thread wraps. Again, pulling down, anchor that in place. And then I'm going to fold that back and make a couple thread wraps over that. Okay, kind of trim this off. The wing is sticking up quite nicely now. Okay, there we go. The next thing I will do is take a section of hackle, and I pre-size this to fit comfortably with this fly. And so I'm going to scrape away some of the extra fibers that are at the bottom of the fly, at the bottom of the stem, and trim this one at the barb, down at the blunt end of the feather. I'm going to tie this in on my side of the fly with several thread wraps, and as I did in a previous fly, I'm making sort of an X wrap, that is one or two wraps in front of the hackle and one behind. That's going to allow this feather to stand up and be easier to tie in. Also, I'm not going to cut off that extra piece of stem that's on the bottom. Make a few more thread wraps over that. And it's just a little bit there that I'm not happy with. Okay, now I can use my hackle pliers and begin to make, actually what I would like to do first is whip finish this, just one wrap to tie that knot off. And then I can pull this out of the way. While I'm wrapping that hackle fiber, that hackle feather around the shank of the hook. Okay, so now this creates sort of a appearance of legs on this fly. And I hope that you can see that I've still left enough material space at the front of the fly to be able to put on the thorax. So tighten my thread a little bit, catch that feather right behind with one or two wraps, then one in front, and clip off that feather. Okay, now just to make another little trimming here, I see a few strands sticking out. And what I'd like to do at this point now is bring my thread all the way up to the eye of the hook, and I still have some residual foam here. And this is going to represent then the thorax and head portion. So if you notice, what I'm doing next is I'm tying in this piece of foam starting right at the eye, much like I did before. I've just gone back perhaps a few millimeters from the eye, and I'm wrapping this piece of foam down tightly with my thread until I bring the thread almost all the way back to where that hackle was tied in. And then bring the thread forward a little bit, pull this foam down, holding it in place. And then I'm still about 1 or 2 millimeters back from the eye. And again, one thread wrap loose, another one tight, pulls it down, and it creates a small bulb-like head on it. And then I can trim this off. And then make a series of wraps to crush down that remaining portion. And then whip finish it at this point. So I hope that it's easy for you to see this bulbous head, a bulbous thorax, and a very small head on this fly. So I did a few whip finishes there, and clip that off. And if you wanted to do so, you could put just a little drop of head cement on there to hold everything in place, which I'll do at this point. Just one drop to complete the fly. So there you have it, a foam black ant. I hope you enjoyed the tying today. Well, I hope that you enjoyed today's session of tying ants, 2 variations of an ant. So perhaps before we conclude, I should talk a little bit about how I would fish ant patterns. Regardless of whether I was fishing stream or river or even a pond, I might try a 2-ant combination, or a combination of an ant along with another floating fly. One of my favorites is a stimulator, but most often the fish will take the ant rather than the larger fly. It just depends upon where you're fishing and what the conditions are. But don't be afraid to try 2 ants together, or a combination of an ant along with another floating fly. So I hope that you've enjoyed today's tying session, and that you will have much success this summer when there's ants present on the water or on the land and falling into the water. Tight lines to you.